Welcome everyone to this new panel of the Rome Dialogues series. My name is Mattia Serra, and today we are going to discuss about Iran. So we know that 2 weeks have almost been passed since the helicopter crash that killed Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi. So there have been a lot of discussions about the implication of this event, and we know there are a few transitions going on, and essentially we can discuss about two different processes of transition. So on the one side, of course, there is a transition towards a new president. And we know that the Iranian regime was pretty quick in announcing new elections, which are going to be held on June 28. There are a lot of questions about these elections. Who is going to be allowed to run for it? How many people will head to the polls? And essentially also, who is going to be the next president? And then, of course, there is a second process of transition, the transition towards the succession of Ali Khamenei, the Supreme Leader. We know that, at least many people think that Raisi, the former president, was supposed to be one possible candidate for that position. And of course, his death certainly changed the situation. So these processes are also unfolding in a context of domestic crisis. There is an economic crisis, some economic difficulties within the country, but also a legitimacy crisis of the Iranian regime more in general. And we all remember the protests 2 years ago. And then, of course, there is the international context, the relations with the US, the evolving relations with Russia and China, and also the regional context, the war in Gaza, and all the consequences of the events of the past 8 months. So we got two really distinguished speakers here today that I'm really glad to have with us and that I'm going to introduce to you. Let me start with Barbara Slavin, who is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. Thank you so much, Barbara, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And then Hamidreza Azizi, who is a visiting fellow at the Stiftung Wissenschaften Politik, which is the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much, Hamid, for being with us today.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So for the audience, before we start, there is a box should be under me. If you have any specific questions, you can just write them there, and I'll be glad to pose them to our two speakers. So, first question, I'm actually looking forward to this conversation because there is a lot to unpack. For you, Barbara, I wanted to ask you about the legacy of Ebrahim Raisi. After his death, we saw people celebrating the helicopter crash, but we also saw, a huge crowd taking part in the funeral. So can you tell us a little bit more about the legacy of Raisi, both at the domestic and international level?
Yeah, first, thank you very much for having me again. Appreciate this. And it's great to be on with Hamid. The legacy of Raisi is not very impressive. This is a man who was an apparatchik of the Islamic Republic in every sense of the word. He was groomed to his various positions, starting as a junior prosecutor in the 1980s when he was one of many who signed off on the summary execution of about 3,000 to 5,000 political prisoners. So he was identified with repression, I think, from the very beginning. He was a loyalist to Khamenei, comes from Mashhad, a very important city in Iran, married well, the daughter of the most important Ayatollah in Mashhad, was very servile and loyal to the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and was rewarded with a succession of good positions, including head of the judiciary. He ran for president for the first time in 2017 and lost rather badly. And then in 2021, when Hassan Rouhani had finished his second term, Khamenei and company engineered Raisi's election by making sure that no one could run against him who had any chance of winning. So he, quote unquote, won in an election with the lowest turnout of any presidential election in the history of the Islamic Republic. And he was an unimpressive and thoroughly predictable president, continued to sign off on brutal repression during the Women Life Freedom protests, and continued to support a foreign policy approved by the Supreme Leader of focusing on Russia, China, and the neighbors. The one achievement was not really his achievement. That was restoring relations with Saudi Arabia. That was done by Ali Khamenei, then the National Security Advisor of Iran. And the former Prime Minister of Iraq, Khamenei, had a lot to do with it as well, with China swooping in at the end. So his own achievements, I mean, the economy remained very poor, and the country very repressive and depressed. I met him twice at the United Nations and was struck both times by his ignorance and his belligerence. He seemed to know very little about how the world works. And when he sensed that his answers were not really being received well, he would simply speak in a louder tone and yell at you. This was his idea of being diplomatic. I've met all of his predecessors going back to Rafsanjani, and I would have to say he was the least impressive Iranian political figure I have ever met. So there.
Okay. Pretty clear and pretty grim. Hamid, do you have anything to add on this, image of his legacy?
First of all, thank you for the invitation once again, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with Barbara. That was a very comprehensive account, I think. What I can add is maybe to basically talk a little bit about how Raisi's basically personal characteristics and his kind of factional base would make him the favorite candidate for Khamenei and the deep state in general. To have him as president for this kind of transitional period that you mentioned in the beginning. So basically, Raisi, as Barbara also mentioned, was a very weak president. I mean, in terms of his personality and also in terms of lacking any political, economic, or foreign policy vision of his own. Which would make him a suitable person to pursue the kind of will of Khamenei. And that was one of the reasons that even before, both before and after his death, basically, Khamenei has praised him and his role in words that he has never used for other, late figures of the Islamic Republic. And also, he was actually an insider with a few very important characteristics. Being an insider, again, as Barbara mentioned quite correctly, he came through a process of, he basically was groomed, that was the correct word, I think, to the positions that he had from the head of the judiciary and to, later to presidency. But in this process, he established some links with important parts of the conservative camp. So we can later go on to the details of this kind of intra-factional rivalry. But what I can mention very briefly is that, of course, his background as a cleric, and also his attachment to Alam al-Huda, the Friday prayer of Mashhad, made him kind of at least an acceptable person to the clerical part, the clerical establishment of the Islamic Republic, and the sort of clerical conservative faction, which is still important, and it will remain important at least as long as Khamenei is there. Then, his characteristics as being weak and loyal was also very interesting for the IRGC, which has been, and the core leadership of the IRGC, which has been, I would say, running the show for at least the past 2 decades, sometimes unsuccessfully, like the elections that brought to power Rouhani, but more recently with more limited scope for public participation, of course, kind of in a more successful way. And also, after becoming president, his cabinet actually was, the majority in his cabinet somehow belonged to the ultra hardline end of the conservative faction, people who are attached to the so-called Stability Front, or in Persian, Cephe Paydari. And so this made him sort of a bridge, between different factions of the conservative camp. So for this reason, I think finding someone who can replace him and basically allow the quote-unquote engineers to proceed with their plans as they were doing before his death, that would be difficult. So I will stop here for now, and then we can discuss the details, of course.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hamid. Very lot of things that you mentioned. So I'll stay on the topic of the elections and the succession of the Raisi. So who's going to be the next president? That's the big question. Barbara, for you. So you mentioned that the 2021 elections were the ones with the lowest turnout in the history of Iran. So what's your expectation for these elections? Do you think this is going to change? And follow up, who is going to take part in these elections in terms of candidates and so on?
Yeah, well, just today, I believe the process has begun where people who want to run for president in Iran are going and registering. But the decision will be made by something called the Guardian Council, which is a body that vets all candidates for elected offices in Iran, and its members are largely appointed by the Supreme Leader. So again, the decision will fall to him who he decides he wants to allow to run. I imagine they will allow some so-called moderates, but probably not people who have much name recognition inside or outside Iran. We'll know, I think, at the end of this process, when we see the list of candidates, who is likely to be let through. There are a couple of names out there. I mean, I suppose the most dreaded name is Saeed Jalili, who has tried to run for president before and has not been successful. He's an extreme hardliner, very ideological, very anti-Western, rigid, unpleasant person, and would be, I think, a rather controversial choice. So it'll be interesting to see if he is allowed through. Another name that pops up from time to time is Ali Larijani, who is from a very prominent family supporting the Islamic Republic and who has played a number of roles over the last 30, 40 years. Not very charismatic. If he was not allowed to run in 2021, if he's allowed to run this time, he might have a chance. But again, it would depend on who else is allowed to run. And then there are a few others who are connected with the regime and with various aspects of it. Parviz Fatah, I believe, is one name I've seen. A hardliner, also well-connected, particularly on the business side of things, I think. There's the current vice president, but he would have to resign in order to run. So, it'll be interesting for people like us who like to do this sort of Kremlinology. I don't think it will be of much interest to the ordinary Iranian, and it will really look like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. I think that the question is, will they try to replicate the Raisi model and find someone who could run for president, who could then be a contender for Supreme Leader or not? That's what I'm really looking for.
I mean, we're going to discuss this in a little bit, but so we also saw in 2021 that many candidates were disqualified, so they weren't even allowed to run. So you expect this to happen again?
Yeah, I think they might allow perhaps a Larijani into the mix just to look like they're being more open-minded and to try to attract some greater degree of participation. But, with all due respect, Ali Larijani is a very cerebral figure. He is not a charismatic politician. So it would be remarkable if even his entrance into the competition would really inspire anyone.
Okay, thank you so much. Regarding this, Hamid, Barbara briefly mentioned the issue of the succession of Khamenei. You were also discussing that before. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. So who do you think would be a possible candidate for this succession? And then, from this, a more general question, Khamenei has been the supreme leader for a very long time, since 1989. So we could argue that he actually changed the image and the structure of the Islamic Republic. So with this question about the succession of Khamenei, there is also a question about the future of the Islamic Republic and the future of its institutions. So how do you think these two questions are related to each other?
That's the million-dollar question, of course, which everybody these days is trying to find an answer for. And the caveat is that, of course, it's an area of kind of speculation more than analysis. But at least we can think in the framing, in the context of a few scenarios, and then based on that, we can discuss. Let me start by the discussions about Raisi's potential to become the next supreme leader. So because actually before he was chosen as president in 2021, in 2017 election, actually, in which he lost to Rouhani. Even back then, there were talks about him being the favorite candidate, as he was actually for the system, to elevate him, to basically use this presidency, Raisi being in the position of president, as a ladder to elevate him to supreme leadership. So on this, I differ a little bit with some people who are basically mentioning this and discussing this, because my argument is that even if in the beginning Raisi was such a candidate, and that would be for the reasons that I mentioned, if we could think of a scenario in which Raisi would be the supreme leader, he would be the puppet, let's say, of the deep state and the IRGC, because of his weak characteristic, because of the kind of lack of strategic vision. So in that case, Raisi would simply act as sort of a figurehead to keep the clerical elements of the political system, while IRGC would continue what it has been doing so far in terms of dominating different aspects of the Iranian politics and economy, maybe in a kind of even in an even freer manner. So that would be the scenario. So after his death, and for this same reason, there are people who are arguing that it might be actually his death might have been not an accident, might be the result of some internal sort of competition between him and Mujtaba Khamenei, who's another name mentioned as the potential supreme leader after Khamenei. So again, I'm having a hard time believing that, because actually, Mujtaba and the network that he has in the office of the supreme leader, they have been already in charge, and actually, I think Raisi's supreme leadership would guarantee that they would stay in the shadows, in the sense that they would preserve whatever advantages they have accumulated over the past few decades, without being the target of kind of public scrutiny, or without being held responsible for failures. So actually, I think Raisi would be a favorable candidate for Mujtaba Khamenei as well, and that's why I think the main gap that appeared after Raisi's death, it's not about the presidency per se. It's about the succession to the next supreme leader. So one thing is for sure, it is there's not going to be any other candidate, at least nothing that I can imagine, that would be chosen as the next president in the waiting for supreme leadership. So the importance of presidency at this moment is that once Khamenei dies, whoever is holding this position needs to be in harmony with the IRGC and other branches in order to have a smooth process. So that's the importance of basically presidency at the moment. So it's going to be actually two phases. In the first phase, they need to make sure that somebody who can be trusted is going to be basically appointed, I would say, as the president, and then to think about potential people or maybe even potential scenarios for the future of the Islamic Republic. So there we can speak about quite a few different scenarios, from Mujtaba himself to other people like Ayatollah Arafi, for example, whose name have been mentioned, to even a total overhaul from a clerical system to more like a military dictatorship. And in between, we shouldn't forget the societal dynamics that have been going on and intensified since the women life freedom movement. So we shouldn't kind of overlook the possibility of a public uprising actually once Khamenei dies, and then that would change a lot of dynamics. Iran is a land of surprises, and that is actually this kind of unpredictability is the only predictable thing about Iran, I would say. So these are the variables that we need to take into account when discussing about the future of the system.
Thank you so much, Hamid. So a lot of variables to take into consideration. I wanted to give Barbara an opportunity to jump in on this. I saw you nodding while Hamid was talking, especially the part on the deep state. Is there anything else you want to say about this?
Yeah, no, I largely agree with his analysis, and I think it's the unpredictability of Iranian politics that has kept many of us very interested in this country for such a long time. No one predicted that Mohammad Khatami would win in 1997. There have been, certainly Ahmadinejad was a surprise in many ways. The question, I think, Raisi was ideal because he was so docile and unimaginative. Once someone is elected president, can the system be sure that person can be controlled, will not go rogue? So they really have to find someone who has come up through the system, who's been vetted thoroughly and won't have his own ideas about how to do things. I'm not sure. Again, I mean, Raisi was unique, and they used to call him Mr. Sixth Grade because he had no real secular education. He only had a religious education, and everything that he got was through the Islamic Republic. He had no independence from it. So again, we have to see. In terms of Supreme Leader, I mean, there are other names that have been out there. The idea that Mujtaba would actually be Supreme Leader, I think, remains controversial, because then Iran would simply have gone from a monarchy led by a Shah to a monarchy led by clerics with hereditary succession, and I think it would be embarrassing on many levels. Mujtaba is more important in the shadows, continuing to try to control the interests of his family and so on. But they could also have a council of some sort that would take over. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities. As long as the IRGC retains its preeminence, I don't think they really care so much what the figurehead is in front of it.
Clear. There was something else that also Hamid mentioned before. And Barbara, I wanted to ask you also about this. Hamid mentioned the possibility of a public uprising after the death of Khamenei. So we were talking about, the fact that Iranian politics is very unpredictable, but perhaps, is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, Iranians have a habit of coming out in the streets whenever they're given an opportunity. And we have to remember, this was a system that came out of a revolution that featured very large demonstrations, and that routinely has demonstrations organized by the government and not organized by the government. And whether it's a victory by a football team or some other event, people come out. They come out in the streets. And we have seen more and more protests since 2009, since the Green Movement, over a variety of issues, whether they be economic or political, or the women life freedom, in terms of the efforts to control the dress and behavior of women and men. I would expect when Khamenei dies, they will organize massive mourning ceremonies, which could turn into violent anti-government demonstrations. Iranians are very clever, and they would know how to subvert their permission to come out in the streets in mourning into something quite different. But whether it would lead to anything, there's no leadership. There's no obvious organization. The cleverest people are either in prison or in exile. And so we saw what happened with Women, Life, Freedom. It eventually petered out, and even the so-called leaders in the diaspora turned on each other. I just don't know where it goes. But for sure, I think there would be huge expressions of anger and of a desire for the end to the Islamic Republic when Khamenei goes.
Thank you so much. So we touched upon a lot of different topics in just 25 minutes. But now I want to jump on the regional and international dimension, because this is also part of the equation that we have to take into account. Hamid, I wanted to start with you with the regional dimension. And thinking also about this transition that we were discussing, the transition towards a new president and the transition also towards a new foreign minister. What's your take on this? Can you tell us a little bit more about Iranian regional policy at this stage and how this might be impacted from this transitional moment?
What's clear is that Iranian foreign policy in general and regional policy in particular is determined not by the administration, but by the Supreme Leader and, again, when it comes to the region, of course, the IRGC and its Quds Force. And the role of the Quds Force actually has been on the rise, at least since the Arab Spring uprisings, and then Iran's intervention in Syria, then during the fight against ISIS, Iran also basically expanding its basically the influence that it already had in Iraq and in other places. And that was to the extent that in that famous leaked audio interview by Zarif in the final months of his basically ministry, he clearly said that the basically diplomacy or the foreign ministry was sidelined by the battlefield. So this dichotomy of battlefield versus diplomacy has become actually one of the kind of highly debated concepts in Iran already. So for that reason, I don't expect much changes, especially at this very important stage, because we are still having the war in Gaza, and the understanding among the Iranian leaders has been that, and it was just today in this so-called letter that Khamenei, an open letter to the American students, basically, he clearly spoke about how he sees the victory of the resistance front, quote unquote, as a result of these whole developments and the extension of the resistance front now to the US, etc. So this is the understanding. So this understanding basically prompts the Iranian leaders to preserve those achievements. And that was quite obvious in the sidelines of Raisi's funeral. There was an unprecedented meeting in the sense that it was public, unprecedented meeting in Tehran between the senior representatives of all the Iran-backed groups in the region, from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Iraqi militias, with senior commanders of the IRGC, General Salami and General Ghani of the Quds Force. So that was a clear signal. And in order to make sure that the signal has been taken by the other side quite correctly, we have seen actually an increase in the attacks by the Iraqi militias, for example, against the Israeli ports over the past week or so. So in that sense, we are going to see much of continuity and not so much change. And the dynamics are going to be basically determined by the IRGC. But one thing is important, I think, and that's the absence of Amir Abdullahian as the guy who was called, among the regime supporters as the diplomat of resistance. So his role was important, I think, in first of all trying at least to gather international support for these different so-called resistance groups, because at the end of the day, I mean, Syria aside, because it is still in the crisis mode, Iran is the only state actor in the axis of resistance. So his role was very important as the spokesperson, I would say, of the axis of resistance. The role that he played, especially in the first phase, is warning the United States, for example, that a more extensive US involvement would result in the whole resistance front being activated, and so on and so forth. So in this very important stage that talks are going on to end the war in Gaza, and of course different parties, Arab states in this case, for example, want to elevate their regional status as a result of these talks. Absence of the foreign minister, especially this foreign minister who was dealing primarily with the region, could be important. So on the battlefield side of things, I think we are going to see more continuity. On the diplomacy side, there might be some disruptions, especially because Bagheri Kani, who is now the acting foreign minister, he lacks regional expertise. He's a guy dealing with the nuclear diplomacy. I'm sure Barbara has more to say.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And, I'm glad you mentioned Zarif at the beginning of your response, because it was also interesting, to understand, what you were saying about the leak. And, it seems that there was some kind of, difficult relation with the Revolutionary Guards. It's also interesting to see this jump with Amir Abdullahian, who, from the things that you said, seem to be very much aligned with the IRGC. This is interesting. So, Hamid said a few things about the US. He mentioned the letter about the
axis of resistance. Who knew we're a new front in the axis? I read that letter and I just thought, how incredibly tone deaf. The students who've been demonstrating on American college campuses are not doing this at the behest of Iran. What he was doing was essentially giving ammunition to all the right-wingers, right-wing conspiracy theorists in the United States who say, oh, these students who are supporting the Palestinians, they're just the tools of Iran and Hamas and terrorism. So thank you, but no thank you, Ayatollah Khamenei. We Americans who are critical of the war in Gaza do not need your help and encouragement. But it's kind of, it's classic that they would do that. And there is division in the United States, and obviously Iran hopes to exploit in some way.
This is exactly what I wanted to ask you. I saw a piece that you recently wrote about this topic. Yeah. What kind of possibility do you think this transitional phase poses for the US in its Iran policy?
Yeah, well, I think Iran is in a very fragile state in a lot of ways because of this unexpected transition, all the other problems that the country faces and so on. And one thing that we have seen, I didn't mention it earlier, that happened under Raisi, it had nothing to do with Raisi, but it happened under him. And that was after the end of the formal negotiations over a revival of the Iran nuclear deal. There was a channel that was kept open with the United States, direct, indirect, sometimes through Oman. Various Americans from the Biden administration have kept up these contacts, have been able to send messages to Iran to try to de-escalate tensions. We got a hostage release just before the Gaza war with 5 American dual nationals who were released in return for what was supposed to be the unfreezing of some Iranian assets. After a pause, these contacts have resumed. And while Iran has continued to advance its nuclear program, it has not enriched to weapons grade yet, or as far as we know, made a decision to actually build a nuclear weapon. So there have been these kinds of useful contacts. I suggested that we take advantage of this time to put some more proposals on the table toward de-escalation, whether it be regionally or on the nuclear file. Unfortunately, on the nuclear file, it looks like we're going in the opposite direction. The Europeans who had been very supportive of diplomacy with Iran, have very much soured on Iran for a variety of reasons. Human rights, Ukraine, dual nationals being kept hostage, a variety of things. And they want a motion of censure against Iran at the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which meets in Vienna next week. If there is such a motion of censure, Iran, I'm sure, will do something provocative to retaliate. The US is actually trying to encourage the Europeans not to put forward such a measure, but it looks as though it's not succeeding. So that could be very dicey in Vienna next week. Biden administration policy, frankly, is just to get through the summer and get to our elections without World War III. Full stop. That is the goal in foreign policy, not to achieve anything magnificent, but just get through it without things getting immeasurably worse.
And there is still that vacancy about the US Iran envoy, right?
We have an acting envoy. The actual envoy, Rob Malley, was obliged to step down. There's some investigation about whether some classified documents were not properly handled. There have been a lot of rather nasty charges with absolutely no substantiation that I've seen in the right-wing press. But there has been no definitive word on this, and it's frankly very unfair. And I hope that the State Department clears this up so Rob Malley can go on with his life.
But the bottom line is that the supposedly U.S. envoy for Iran security clearance has been basically stopped and cancelled. So this is also something interesting to look at this moment.
Well, it's being handled by the National Security Council, not the State Department. Brett McGurk, who is the Middle East envoy for everything, it seems now, whether it's Saudi-Israeli normalization or Iran, he's the one who's been in charge of the file, it seems.
Okay, thank you so much. So I received a few questions from the audience. And there are actually a lot of questions, so it's actually a little bit difficult to decide. So the first one, perhaps it would be interesting for Hamid. They're asking us about the deepening ties between Iran on one side and Russia and China on the other. This, of course, is a major topic that we haven't discussed today, but I think it's interesting to mention this. So they're asking about, the prospects for the relations between Iran and the West, considering these deepening ties with Russia and China. What do you think about that?
I think at least since Raisi came to power, it has nothing to do with the person of Raisi, of course. As I said, the strategic decisions are made at the higher level. But the thing is that basically the kind of consensus, at least at the foreign policy level, that Raisi's presidency brought to the Iranian government, made Iran to basically make its final decision to go full force eastward. So there's quite a few different reasons for that. We know that this so-called Look East policy was already in place. That wasn't the invention of Raisi, or it wasn't a new phenomenon. Since Rafsanjani's years, it was there, and then during Ahmadinejad, there were some attempts. What happened actually was that the strategic decision makers in the Islamic Republic, I think, they started looking at the kind of broader global developments and trying to basically factor their primarily anti-Western policy into those. So that can basically explain decisions like supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine, which has further deteriorated the relationship, especially with Europe, as Barbara mentioned, or the very sort of strong interest in multilateral frameworks involving Russia and China, like BRICS and else. So that's partly about our understanding of, the Islamic Republic's understanding of the changing world and transition in global politics as they define it. And on the other hand, it has to do with the disappointment of the relationship with the West and whether it's going to bring any benefits. Because one of the things that is rightly mentioned, I have mentioned this quite a few times, is that by siding with Russia in the war against Ukraine, they have actually invited the Europeans to have a stronger position against Iran. But it seems that the understanding on the Tehran side is that there could be no benefits in the relationship with Europe anyway. They couldn't save the JCPOA in any substantial way after US withdrew, despite, for example, this economic mechanism that they established. And there's a lot of different things. And also the experience of the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. So these two things combined, Iranian leaders, Islamic Republic leaders, seeing the world changing on one hand, and then seeing no benefits in the relationship with the West has made them basically push them more eastward. So in that sense, I don't expect any change as long as the Islamic Republic is alive one way or another. At best, we may achieve some tensions management with West, but no comprehensive deal, even no restoration of the JCPOA, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Actually, there is a question which is very much connected to this. It's a question generally about this look to the East policy, which is also one of the cornerstone of the foreign policy of Raisi. They are asking about Pakistan, which I think it's an interesting example. They are mentioning the fact that it was one of the last visits by Raisi before he died. So perhaps, do you want to say? I mean, I give both of you the chance to say something about this. I know it's very specific, but perhaps you have a view on this.
Is this for me or for Hamid?
As you please.
Yeah. I think he went to apologize for the fact that Iran attacked Pakistan not long ago after there was a terrorist incident at a commemoration service for Qasem Soleimani, the late leader of the Quds Force, and the Iranian response was to bomb Kurdistan in Iraq and Pakistan, Baluchistan in Pakistan, and it was a real aberration because Iran and Pakistan have managed to keep pretty civil relations over many years. Again, Raisi he went where he was told to go, probably just to patch things up.
Especially because you were mentioning in the beginning this unpredictability of Iranian politics, and in that case, the bombing of Pakistan, that was also very much unpredictable, I think, for everyone. Hamid, a few seconds. Do you want to add anything about this look to the East policy, looking also beyond China?
The look to the East policy actually has evolved in the past 3 years. Again, I refuse to say under Raisi. And in many different ways. One way is that it went beyond focus on specific countries, these great powers, Eastern great powers like Russia and China. There's a multilateral element also added to that, as we see in BRICS, in SCO, and others. So this is apart from the conceptual shift that we see. So for Iran now, when they speak about look east, it involves neighbors and also basically countries like Russia and China. So what we usually see as global south, in a kind of adapted version of the global south with an emphasis on the neighbors, and then basically to use it as a counterbalance to the West, also as an alternative for economic and security cooperation partnership. Basically.
Yeah, if I can just add one point, and that is that Iran's economy now relies on selling oil to China, over 1 million barrels a day, and it is laundered through the United Arab Emirates and Malaysia, so that it doesn't even count. The Chinese, don't say that they're importing it directly, but they are indirectly, and that is vital.
Yeah. Okay, time is up. Thank you so much. I mean, we touched really a lot of very different topics, from this transitional period towards a new president, and then the question about who is going to be the next supreme leader, then of course the legitimacy crisis, and the foreign international context. Thank you so much for this conversation. Hamid, it was a pleasure to have you with us here today. And Barbara, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Thank you.
See you next time.